Let's talk about this whole fetishizing of smart and genius, right? We're really in an era of fetishizing so-called genius, tech whiz kid, financial genius. Usually all this genius worship is around money-making schemes and skills and technological stuff. And these people with these skills are actually becoming a sort of new celebrity, right time, right place folks who happen to understand the obtuse nuances of computers and engineering and derivatives and financial markets. And we often forget and in many cases lacked the conscience and ethics, which is what separated them from the rest of the pack. So they were able to do the icky things that ultimately made people unfathomably large amounts of big bucks. Genius obviously isn't limited to money making and tech. A person can be a genius or really smart at a whole bunch of different things, at medicine, at research and scholarship, at art, filmmaking, in the kitchen, science, athletics, entrepreneurial ideas, writing. And obviously, genius is a relative term. The society the so-called genius is embedded in has to value the thing they do and view it as an extraordinary ability. Some geniuses are often found well after the fact. But we are in the era of the cult of genius, and it feels at times it's kind of getting dangerous. So I'm only concerned here about human relationships. I ain't trying to change society. So it begs the question, why are so many geniuses assholes? Now, not all are. Personally, my favorite writer, whom I think is a genius, Barbara Kingsolver, she took the royalties from her Pulitzer Prize winning book and opened an addiction treatment and residential center for women in Appalachia. So there's someone who is that rarest of things, a good genius. But because that's not the norm, and the geniusness is often clocked when the genius's accomplishments are so public and publicly vaunted and shared, that there may be unheralded geniuses. For example, some unknown genius mathematician laboring away in a lab at some university somewhere. But we typically only hear about the ones who sort of publicly make it. And I'm not even going to touch the issue of the psychopathic genius, which is obviously a thing. And some people really show these psychopathic geniuses with absolutely no remorse, who are calculated and cunning and all of that. They just do not have time for feelings of empathy, and they're shown a lot of grace. Like I said, they're a genius, and all of them goes into their genius. But they're still psychopathic and dangerous, full stop. I don't care what they're able to make or produce. These are people who ultimately, interpersonally speaking, are not safe. But smart, genius, whatever you want to call it, like I said, I only care about it insofar as it may trap people into toxic relationships and trauma-bonded cycles. And this is where genius does its harm. This matters a lot with vulnerable and malignant narcissism. Listen, the grandiose narcissistic folks don't have to be geniuses. They are compelling for their charm, their charisma, their confidence, and their swagger. They are shiny and sexy and alluring. But the vulnerable and malignant folks, not so much of that shiny stuff. So there's got to be something they bring to the table that draws other people in. And this is where genius and smart can often, not always, but can often become part of the sort of fodder of their appeal in some cases. I've talked with many people who are in relationships with vulnerable and or malignant narcissistic folks, some cases both. And when they look back, they would often say, no, there wasn't a lot of charm and charisma. There weren't gifts or flowers or really romantic, not even any romantic nights out, really. There weren't even really fun vacations. So when we talked further, these were folks who did not want to get into this kind of relationship again, as you can imagine. The one thing that the people in these relationships reflected on, that was the thing that hooked them, was that this person they got into the relationship with was smart. And that word meant different things to different ones of them. In one case, it was a vulnerable narcissistic partner who went to an Ivy League university. So that was the smart there. In one case, it was a vulnerable and malignant narcissistic partner who was just really smart about some esoteric point in finance and had a big finance job and was a partner at a big firm. In another case, it was a person whose partner went to some big law school and had a big fancy law job where he won all his cases and was deemed a legal genius. In another case, it was a person who was some tech AI genius who sold out his stake and made a fortune at a relatively young age. In another story, it was a guy married to a woman who was some science professor and she was deeply invalidating, but she was forever held on a pedestal for all of her innovations. The partners of these people, all these smart people, said, I had to recognize that what they were doing was amazing. And they said things like, I assumed that someone who went to a great school or who was so great at a job was disciplined and had a great work ethic. And some of them even tied it to early life issues, saying that they themselves, the partners I was talking to, said they came from families where they didn't take education seriously or they were not ambitious, and everyone in their family seemed so angry and stuck. So meeting this smart, genius person in their lives felt inspirational. And a strong work ethic or discipline, okay, they're not interpersonal virtues. I suppose discipline is discipline. And the whole tendency we have to overvalue people who work hard over their capacity to show up interpersonally, we value smart and discipline over kindness and empathy, is part of this larger problem. It also meant that these folks who were in these relationships I was talking to fell into the, well, they have the goods, so I guess they can brag about it stance. So with these cases I'm thinking of where I've talked to these people, they did track that the narcissistic, smart, genius person in their lives knew their stuff, was vaunted and celebrated by others, or had credentials, or made lots of money, or had lots of success. So when their partner would start with, well, I'm so much smarter than those guys, aggrieved narcissistic rants, their partners acknowledged that the rants were annoying to listen to, but that their partners did have the smarts, so it was gross, but it felt like what they were saying was accurate. And they even had empathy for this idea that their partners were really smart and deserved the promotions and the honors. So when they didn't get them, their partners' victimized rants felt plausible, like why wouldn't they get recognized? They're really smart. Let's go back to something I've said on this channel before. Smart, genius, these are not virtues. They are skills, they are abilities, but they are not indicative in any way of compassion, empathy, respect, or kindness. In fact, smart genius types can be sort of one-trick ponies who overdevelop just one skill set and may weaponize it and lord it over other people. A sort of, I can't be bothered with your petty nonsense. I'm too smart for all of that. We are definitely in an era where so-called smart people are getting away with a lot. And I gotta say, I feel pretty helpless in the face of that as I'm guiding people through these relationships. But like I said, my focus is on protecting and fostering healing for people who get into narcissistic relationships. And that means understanding what are the things that make unhealthy people attractive, and getting past the swagger of the grandiose narcissist or the basic love bombing tactics and viewing this as us learning to not give too much weight or make assumptions or make excuses on the basis of smartness or genius. Many a so-called really genius smart person acts badly and gets a free pass as though the smartness or genius is a substitute virtue. Kind of like, if you're so smart, maybe you don't need to be nice. I don't think so. And it doesn't work in a close relationship. The contempt, the dismissiveness, and the devaluing that can come and be buttressed by the smart person can mean that you can also feel that maybe you are missing something. The sort of, well, they're so smart. They can't be that bad. Yes, they can. You would be better off with somebody of sort of average intelligence who is kind when it comes to having a long-term relationship than you would be being with a genius who's narcissistic. And that takes us to the basic struggle that people have to understand what does make long-term relationships work. At the deepest, healthiest level, that is compassion, empathy, safety, warmth, patience, kindness, respect, and fostering growth. That's it. That's a healthy relationship. However, we live in a world where things like resources and success and money and genius are all viewed as virtues. They're not virtues. They certainly can all make life a lot more convenient and certainly get you comfort, but psychological safety, not necessarily. If you win that life lottery and find a partner who is the genius or just the smart person who also happens to be compassionate, empathic, warm, and kind, you just hit one hell of a lottery. It is rare. And that is because of how we socialize so-called smart people or genius people. And the entitlement we can often foster in them by praising their smartness and accolades and accomplishments, and sometimes not even expecting them to behave empathically. It's as though the smartness becomes an excuse and is often coupled with their contempt for other people's emotions and needs. We have become so reliant on the stuff that these so-called geniuses have created in the world. Social media and packages sent from all over the place in 2 minutes to our doors, and all forms of tech innovations and computers in our pockets. Okay, use their innovations. Just don't marry them. And if you came from a family with a parent who is extolled as a genius or oh so smart, you know this territory. You may have even revered that parent at one time yourself. You might have also been scared of them and wonder what was wrong with you, because after all, they're a genius. And you may have found that the trauma-bonded patterns were made worse because the prevailing wisdom was to worship that parent's intelligence and contributions. But none of that is worth a damn when you are a kid who just wants to be seen and loved and attuned to. So always look for the healthy stuff first. Do not let the smart trick you. It's a tricky trap and something I have talked about before, but it is a trap that people are still getting pulled into. A genius may be great for an interesting conversation at a cocktail party, but maybe not to take home for the long term. Hold out for the person who won't shame you for your emotions or vulnerability or needs, or turn their so-called genius into a weapon that they use to dominate. Because there's no smartness in the world that feels the way being really loved and seen and safe does.